Good morning. Today I'm going to be doing a voiceover of this slideshow. I had tried to do it in a larger chunk and it didn't work, so I'm going to do it in sections. So the first one, I'll be exploring a little bit of what came before modernism, and then I'll be digging into a little bit more about why modernism is a thing. And then I will be exploring with you guys a little bit about some examples to show you what modernism looks like in various art forms. So let's dig in today. So, in order to understand modernism, I feel as though it's important to briefly understand a bit about the movement that came before it, Romanticism. So, with Romanticism, it's from the Victorian era. It's from a time of a lot of structure, a lot of rules, a lot of society, very um, established. And so this is an example of a poem that comes from that era called A Glimpse by Walt Whitman. A glimpse through an interstice caught of a crowd of a workmen and drivers in a bar room around the stove, late of a winter night, and I unremarked seated in a corner, of a youth who loves me and whom I love, silently approaching and seating himself near, that he may hold me by the hand. A long while amid the noise of coming and going, of drinking and oath and smutty jest. There we two, content, happy in being together, speaking little, perhaps not a word. So in this poem, we have this man sitting in a bar, crowded with people after work. It's a cold winter night, and they're all hanging out, and it seems like there's people coming and going. People are drinking and swearing and telling dirty jokes. And he spies his lover coming to him, and his lover just sits near him, and they just hold hands in that space. So it's a very calm, personal, um, it's a happy poem. We were going to go see Emily Dickinson's a production about her at the PAC before all of this happened, but here's a poem from her that's also from the Romantic time called Hope is the Thing with Feathers. Hope is a thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. And sweetest in the gale is heard, and sore must be the storm that could abash the little bird that kept so many warm. I've heard it in the chilliest land and on the strangest sea, yet never in extremity it asked a crumb of me. And in this one, it's about hope and having hope and how it sits in your soul and it's there no matter what's going on. And it never asks anything of you, but it's always there for you in all of these really hard times when it's chilly, when you're in strange places, right? So the idea of the romantic period ends up being having a lot of order and meaning and optimism. Things felt stable. They had a very solid faith in the world, could also be religious, very strong structure of morality and values, and their sense of identity was very clear. They referenced a lot of the imagination and the individual in their poetry and their works. Nature was a source of spirituality for many, linking to the transcendentalist age too. They were looking to the past for wisdom and seeing the common man as a hero. So in this, we obviously are getting this very um, clear concept that things seemed all right. I mean, it's not like they didn't struggle or they didn't have hardships. It just means that generally as a whole, there was nothing rocking their boat, as you might say. So for modernism, I want to show you an example of a modernist poem, and then I want to explore what the qualities of modernism are in comparison to the qualities of romanticism. So this poem is called Aftermath by Amy Lowell. I learnt to write to you in happier days, and every letter was a piece I chipped from off my heart, a fragment newly clipped from the mosaic of life, its blues and grays, its throbbing reds, I gave to earn your praise. To make a pavement for your feet, I stripped my soul for you to walk upon, and slipped beneath your steps to soften all your ways. But now my letters are like blossoms pale we strew upon a grave with hopeless tears. I ask no recompense. I shall not fail, although you do not heed. The long, sad years still pass, and I still scatter flowers frail and whisper words of love which no one hears. So we have a poem now that's obviously about the aftermath of a relationship, either from loss or from maybe a breakup. But this person who once upon a time laid their soul down so that their partner's feet could walk upon the earth softly, so that they would chip parts of their heart and give them away. And then in the end, we have blossoms on a grave. We have hopeless tears, long, sad years, words of love that no one will hear. So, in comparison to some of the previous two poems, this poem is definitely a lot more dark. It's exploring some qualities of the human experience that are not necessarily that hopeful, right? It's highlighting on a difficult time of the human experience. So, considering that poem and this picture, the attitude that modernists had toward the world, I think you're starting to pick up on this fact is that they weren't necessarily a big fan of it. So we have this painting called "We Are Making a Better World" by Paul Nash, and it looks like a bomb dropped, and it's a desolate landscape. There's no foliage. It's bleak looking. It's stark. The sun is coming through. There's shadows. It's kind of ominous, right? So we're having this sensation that maybe the modernists didn't think too highly of the world in which they were living. So if we take that and we take the characteristics of what the Romantic period was like, and then we look at the characteristics of modernism, we are faced with these. They're much more concerned with their modern life, right? What it meant to be living as this in the turn of the century. History, instead of being something to look to for wisdom, it was a story of decline, right? Like we went on a downhill trend, is what they kind of felt like everything was going south. Poetry was minimalistic and free verse. There's chaos in the way that they wrote, fragmentation in the lines. It addressed inner thoughts. And to me, I think the biggest one that stands out and why it's important to understand Romanticism first is that it's disillusionment. There was this disappointed sense that they had, because disillusionment means you're disappointed in someone or something that one discovers to be less good than you had once believed. And that's what they had the world that they were living in, the people that they were around, like humanity, life itself, it was less good than they had believed before. So their perspective of the world centered more on chaos. Things were futile, pointless, pessimistic, unstable. There was a loss of faith, a collapse of those morality and values, and they had a very confused sense of identity and place in the world. So the question becomes, why is there this shift between romanticism and modernism? There are many reasons why this occurred, and I'm about to explore a couple of them with you in the next slides. So one of them that you might be surprised about is airplanes. Human flight was such a significant and revolutionary breakthrough that it went beyond the aeronautical community. There was enthusiasm for pilots and aerial exhibitions. We still even have one in Oshkosh nearby to this day. Commercial and military potential of aviation was immense. The fact that people could suddenly travel and think about crossing oceans, suddenly you didn't have to wait for your ship, you could just fly potentially, eventually. Military potential, I'll explore in a minute. There was very much broad cultural implications of flight, artistic expression that aviation inspired. But the impact of the airplane on the 20th century is beyond measure. It really created a whole new world for people at the time. To have humans soaring in the sky was a very, very big deal and a very, very big change. As we saw with Brave New World last year, the whole concept of the automobile being mass produced, where it could become available to regular households. People could travel to work, they could travel to see family, so it allowed them to spread out more. They didn't have to stay localized if they wanted to be able to be near a family. It was probably one of the most significant inventions of the 1920s. And I mean, they're a cornerstone of our lives today, even. Prohibition, surprisingly, also contributed a lot to this. That was the nationwide constitutional ban on the production, importation, transportation, and sale of alcohol between 1920 to 1933. So a lot of illegal activity started as a result of this, like bootlegging, which is when they would illegally produce and sell liquor, and the speakeasies, which we'll encounter some of this with um, Gatsby. These were like these illegal drinking spots that people would be at. And because of all this illegal activity, there was an increasing gang violence and other crimes in a lot of the cities. So there was that general sense of unrest continued. Science developed in medicine and drugs that you could take and procedures and surgical procedures. There was also the introduction of psychology. Sigmund Freud kind of founded this concept of psychoanalysis that popularized the theory that unconscious motives controlled much of our behavior. And he developed a theory of the human mind and human behavior, and then established clinical techniques for helping unhappy people. So, kind of our first foray into the concept of mental health. Now, Freud is generally considered to be a little bit of a loose cannon in some ways for some people nowadays, but he is given credit for having introduced this concept of looking at the brain as influencing behavior, right? So the English novelist Virginia Woolf declared that human nature underwent a fundamental change on or about December 1910. The statement testifies to the modern writer's fervent desire to break with the past, rejecting literary traditions that seemed outmoded and diction that seemed too genteel to suit an era of technological breakthroughs and global violence. So we've explored the technological breakthroughs a bit, and there are others, but those are some big key ones. But global violence is the next that I think is drastically changed the way people acted. So in World War One, it was the deadliest conflict until that point in human history. It claimed tens of millions of casualties on all sides, and the impact of it was felt worldwide on politics, culture, societies. There became a kind of a anti-war sentiment and criticism of the United States government. And as I said, people became disillusioned with the values and ideals of American political democracy and consumer culture. So people who came of age during the First World War and the Roaring Twenties are known as the lost generation. With that was the invention of machine guns. They are rapid fire weapons. And before that, military commanders thought that battles were mostly won by massed charges of men. You think back to any Civil War, Revolutionary War movie you've seen, or even things like Lord of the Rings, like fantasy, medieval style. It's these large armies that travel, and they meet in the middle and they clash, and they fight, face to face combat. But machine guns were invented, which were so fast and they had such a long range, and it made any type of mass charge suicidal. Sadly, commanders in World War One kept trying them even after they moved to trench warfare. Just another example of people being unwilling to change with their circumstances. So the Great Depression occurred, around this time as well. Partly, it was just a rough time in general, with like people, there was death and there was war and there was lack of food and money and stability in the economy, and it caused drastic declines in output, severe unemployment, and acute deflation in almost every country of the world. Um, and it was the harshest adversary faced by Americans since the Civil War. It was compounded by the Dust Bowl that happened in the Midwest. There was a drought, and it lasted for 10 years, which was too long for most farmers to survive that long of a lack of production. And so, to make things worse, the prices for agricultural products dropped to their lowest since the Civil War, and they left in search of work. They became homeless. Almost 6,000 shanty towns called Hoovervilles sprang up in the 1930s. There's just some wage percentages for you guys so that to just understand just how bad it was. 10 years is a really long time for a drought to occur. So here's some pictures. There's some shanty towns in Hooverville, some timeline. You can see like how much crops, 50% of all the crops in Arkansas failed in 1930 to 1931. You can see the end of that timeline. Oop, my bad. You can see at the end of that timeline in 1939 to 1940, Louisiana experiences 115 consecutive days of 90-degree temperatures. And in the pictures below, what was happening when there's no rain that falls on the ground, the dirt doesn't stick together the way that we are used to. And what happens is the layer of topsoil, it becomes dust. It becomes this very light, powdery substance that just kicks up in the wind. And you can see in these pictures, huge rolling clouds of dust would just cover towns. It was horrible. And then World War II started to happen. So compounding, like decades of horrible experiences, we have another world war. And this is where the military aspect of aviation, I think, is predominantly felt. Um, Suddenly, bombs could be dropped from the sky on you, right? And in Europe, this was a bigger deal. Um, but it did hit the United States with Pearl Harbor, and we responded in our patriotic way, and we joined the war. And the food and gas and clothing became rationed. Women went out into the workplace, so it's changed the home structures. Japanese Americans had their rights as citizens stripped from them. They were put into internment camps, and people in the United States grew increasingly dependent on radio reports for news of the fighting overseas. So, just another example of more violence, impacting people. You can see some pictures. I'll let you guys browse those. So, the term modernism refers to the radical shift in aesthetic and cultural sensibilities evident in the art and literature of the post-World War I period. The ordered, stable, and inherently meaningful worldview of the 19th century could not, wrote T.S. Eliot, accord with the immense panorama of futility and anarchy which is contemporary history. Rejecting 19th century optimism, modernists presented a profoundly pessimistic picture of a culture in disarray. So it was a panorama of futility, profoundly pessimistic, a culture in disarray. That's what we're looking at right now in this modernist unit. I have this slideshow posted in the classroom. You guys can watch this video that was shown to children in 19 in the 1950s, with the nuclear war threat. They made videos that children would watch in schools, what to do if a nuclear bomb is dropped. And so I can't even imagine what it's like to grow up in a time where that is common, to be terrified that you are going to get nuked at any moment. So here you can see our chart, right? Pre-modern, modern, right? The difference is so stark and so interesting that I'm excited to explore it with you guys. So here I wanted to show it to you a little bit in some other mediums before we dug into our course curriculum, which is literature, obviously. You can see it in Wander Above the Sea of Fog. It's a very romantic, peaceful. Yeah, he's solitary, but he doesn't seem lonely. But in terms of, the way nature is portrayed, and then you can see the metamorphosis of Narcissus, right, on the right, and that is a modern art piece. It's got some surrealism to it. It's abstract to some degree. It doesn't always make sense. It's kind of chaotic. It doesn't have the same clean and orderly and stable sensation that the other piece does. It just doesn't quite make as much sense. Again, here we have the monarch of the glen, this beautiful deer. And then look, we have leopard and deer, right? The contrast between the two, is the way we're portraying the animal life and what they're doing, right? Very regal deer mixed with this concept of prey, right? This stark, angular painting. Georgia O'Keeffe, one of my favorite painters, she would paint skulls, right? She painted skulls. So very different art was being created at this time. You can see the Scream also is considered a modern work. Architecture. It also appeared in architecture. On the left, we have this very Victorian, ornate, very, very elaborate style Gothic home. And then you can see on the left this Falling Water by Frank Lloyd Wright. It's a beautiful home, but very different. Minimalist, clean lines built into the landscape, right? It's not nearly as ornate or elaborate as the romantic Victorian home is. We have fashion. Women within a span of 40 years, we can see this broad difference in, bustles and skirts and lots of layers and the bulkiness of the clothing. And then you can see on the right we have the slim lines, and it's still got some embellishments, but they're very different, right? Very different pieces. Again, with male fashion, same thing within 40 years, a little bit different. You can see also like in their facial hair, right? Canes, their shoes, the type of coats that they would wear, right? Just some really, really interesting artworks still to consider that are both considered modern pieces. Again, these are in the classroom if you guys would like to explore them a little bit more in your own time. So as we move forward, what we're going to be doing is taking this modern world column, this green category, and we are going to be trying to apply it and find these qualities within other pieces. So I'll be assigning you guys some poetry to try and find chaos and pessimism and instability and confusion inside of them, and then we'll start reading Gatsby and do that. So I hope that this video makes sense and helps. If you have any questions, please email me. I love you all and I miss you all, and I hope you have a good weekend.